Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Procurement in the Child Nutrition Programs webinar, presented by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Food and Nutrition in collaboration with Project PA. I'm Elaine McDonald, coordinator of Project PA, and I will moderate today's webinar. Before we turn it over to our presenters, just a few pieces of housekeeping. We'll take questions following today's presentation. You can use the chat box in the lower left-hand side of your screen to submit questions. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll save them and address them to the presenters at the end. You can download today's slides from the file share box in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The slides are available in two different formats. One is one slide per page, and another is in handout format with 3 slides per page and room for notes. At the end of the webinar, you will find in the file share box a continuing education certificate that you can download. Finally, we're recording today's webinar, and we'll post the webinar, the audio from the webinar, along with the Q&A and the slides, sometime after today's webinar in about a week or two. So having said that, I'm going to turn over the webinar to our presenters. If you can just bear with us for a second as we pull up their presentation. Our presenters today from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Food and Nutrition are Diane DeBoulis and Cecilia Bodie. And with that, I will turn it over to Diane and Cecilia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. Procurement in child nutrition programs is an emerging and important topic because the U.S. Department of Agriculture is placing more emphasis on this subject matter. In the 2016-17 school year, the Division of Food and Nutrition will be responsible for conducting comprehensive procurement reviews at least once every 3 years at each school food authority. So it is critical that you are updated and trained on the procurement information. I'm having a problem, Elaine, advancing the slides. Okay. To begin, let's put the school nutrition program in context of federal, state, and local regulations and requirements. The school nutrition programs are federal programs, therefore they are governed by both government-wide regulations that apply across all federal programs and program-specific regulations that apply specifically to the different child nutrition programs. For example, if you are a local education agency, an LEA, which is the entire school district, or for smaller schools, just the individual school that receives federal funding from the U.S. Department of Education, even if it is passed through the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and you operate the school nutrition programs, the government-wide regulations apply across the board for any area receiving the federal funding, regardless if it is through U.S. Department of Education or USDA. Subsequently, U.S. Department of Education has regulations that apply specifically to their programs. Likewise, USDA has regulations that apply specifically to their programs. We currently recognize that federal agencies may not place an equal emphasis on the government-wide regulations. Similarly, an LEA that operates the school nutrition program and the summer food service program will follow the same government-wide regulations, but there are specific regulations that apply to each of the programs individually. Today's conversation will pertain only to the school nutrition programs. It is important to note there are slight nuances in procurement requirements related to the other child nutrition programs, and they will be covered through different trainings. Today, you will see many references to 2 CFR Part 200. This is known as the Uniform Grant Guidance. These are newly issued government-wide regulations that consolidated and updated a variety of memos, regulations, etc. However, there is not a tremendous difference in the old and new procurement requirements. Therefore, if you are not using the procurement processes discussed in today's webinar, you need to begin as soon as possible. The federal regulations can be accessed from the website www.ecfr.gov. In addition to the federal requirements, public schools must also be familiar with the Pennsylvania School Code. There is not much in school code that pertains to the school nutrition programs. However, there are some items, and today we will cover procurement as it relates to school code. With that, I will now turn the presentation over to Cecilia, who will provide an in-depth review of procurement on the school nutrition programs.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're having some technical difficulties advancing slides, so just bear with us. Okay, if you operate the school nutrition programs in your LEA, and I am assuming you do if you're participating in this webinar, the basis for today's webinar is first understanding that every LEA must have a food service account where all revenue accrue. We frequently get the question if this must be an actual separate bank account. No, it does not, but it must be a separate fund within an account that can track revenues and expenses separately from the other programs and accounts. Federal and state meal reimbursements, meal revenue from paid or reduced price meals, a la carte, and adult meal revenue will accrue to this food service account. Opposite of revenues are the expenses. Government-wide cost principles apply to these expenses. Therefore, all expenses paid for from the food service account must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable. We offer training specific to this topic, so I won't go into this any further at this time. However, I do want to remind everyone that the food service account funds cannot be used for purchasing land, buildings, or renovations. In order for an expense to be allowable, it must be properly procured. When you are incurring expense, it is generally because you procured a product or a service. Because your LEA receives federal dollars, it must follow proper procurement practices, regardless of the dollar amount and regardless of the size of your LEA. And regardless of the dollar amount, there must be free and open competition that takes on different methods depending on the dollar amount of the procurement, and that is what we will be discussing today. There are very specific program requirements related to contracting with a food service management company, in addition to the requirements we are discussing today. Copies of trainings related to procuring the services of a food service management company can be found on PDE's website in pairs download forms. Here is a look at the procurement process from beginning to end. We will cover each in detail. The first step is procurement procedures. Your LEA may already have written procurement procedures. If so, check that the procedures incorporate federal, state, and local requirements. If your LEA has a procedure, familiarize yourself with it. If not, a written procedure must be in place. As previously stated, procurement procedures must incorporate federal, state, and local requirements. In addition, the procurement procedures must incorporate written standards of conduct, which establish policies to avoid real or apparent conflicts of interest and acceptance of gifts and favors. Additionally, it must include disciplinary actions if the code of conduct is violated. The procedures must include bid protest procedures in the event that a vendor has a concern related to the procurement practice that was utilized. You will hear me emphasize the importance of documentation throughout the webinar today, so build it right into your procedures. Before you can really go down the road much further, you need to identify what it is that you are looking for, whether it be a good or a service. You will gather as much information as possible related to the product or service so you are very familiar with what you are intending to purchase. You will also conduct an independent cost analysis so you know roughly what the anticipated cost of the good or service will be. This cost determines the procurement method and becomes important in the next step. Please keep in mind that while you are doing this research, contractors or vendors that draft specifications, requirements, etc., must be excluded from competing for the procurement. Reason being is because it gives that vendor an unfair advantage and prevents full and open competition. Now that you know what you want and about how much it will cost, you can identify the procurement methods you will use. If you are only working with federal thresholds, the values are very easy, either above $150,000 or below $150,000. However, if you are a public school, then there are additional thresholds that come in at lower dollar amounts, which tends to make it confusing and a little more complicated. We will refer back to this chart a few times. There are three types of procurement: micro purchase, which is very new, informal procurement, and formal procurement. You can always use formal procurement, but you probably don't want to use it except when necessary because of the amount of work associated with it. The micro purchase threshold is new with 2 CFR Part 200. We are still learning about how and when it can be applied. However, what we know is that when the aggregate dollar amount of a transaction does not exceed $3,500, you can select a vendor to provide the product or service so long as purchases using this threshold are equitably distributed among qualified suppliers. So if I need to buy gluten-free products from a supplier and the aggregate dollar amount will be less than $3,500, I can purchase from any qualified supplier. So long as the next time I make a purchase of gluten-free products, I purchase from a different qualified supplier. In this case, full and open competition is achieved in this small purchase by equitably distributing the business among qualified suppliers. One year I purchase from supplier A, next year from supplier B. Let's talk about informal procurement. Using the chart, you can see the dollar thresholds where informal procurement is allowable. Combining school code for public schools and the federal regulations adds a lot of levels and can make it confusing. Hopefully this chart helps you identify the procurement method to use once you know the anticipated cost. With informal procurement, specifications or product descriptions are written to provide enough detail so that you get the product you are seeking, and vendors have enough information to adequately respond. Writing specifications, especially for food, is particularly challenging, and I would like to see us or USDA develop stronger resources on this topic. Once the specifications are written, You obtain 3 written or telephone quotations by contacting at least 3 qualified vendors. If 3 vendors do not exist, thoroughly document how you made this determination. Using this method, the lowest responsible bidder is awarded the contract. It is fairly cut and dry that the award goes to the lowest priced vendor, providing that contractor possesses the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of the proposed procurement. Considerations include contractor integrity, compliance with public policy, record of past performance, and financial and technical resources. And they must not be on the federal suspension or debarment list, and document everything. Let's discuss some examples of informal procurement. You need to purchase bread. Bread is a perishable item, and the aggregate purchase amount is less than $150,000. Therefore, you can use informal procurement. You write specifications so that every vendor you contact knows exactly what you are looking for. Sliced bread, hot dog rolls, hamburger rolls, etc. Weight proportion for each, total quantity of each you expect to purchase, whole grain content to meet the whole grain rich requirement, delivery times and days, etc. Without this information, vendors can't give you the best, most accurate quote. In this scenario, we are saying you want a delivery 3 times per week to each of the 5 schools in your district. You obtain quotes via the phone and or email. Be sure to document and retain the documentation. You contact 4 vendors. Vendor 1 provides a quote for all of the products you are looking for, but they won't deliver 3 times a week. They are, however, the lowest cost. Vendor 2 did respond to your email by saying your school district is outside of their service radius. Vendor 3 meets all of your specifications in their quote. Vendor 4 also meets all of your specifications in their quote. However, you used this company last year and had to stop service with them because they provided stale product. Who does the award go to? In this scenario, the award would go to vendor 3 because they are the only responsible bidder. For different reasons, vendor 1, 2, and 4 are not responsible to your specifications. In another scenario, you need to purchase milk. We often receive the question of why do you need to bid out milk when the state establishes the prices? The state prices are the maximum price that can be charged. It is possible, maybe not likely, that prices will vary. Additionally, we typically see that milk orders also contain non-milk beverages. Your milk purchase will be below $150,000, so you can use informal procurement. You develop the specifications similar to what we just reviewed in the bread example. In this scenario, you need delivery 3 times per week between 6 and 7 a.m. to each of your 5 schools. You call 3 vendors and they respond with quotes by email. You retain everything for documentation. Vendor 1 provides a quote but will only deliver 1 day a week. Vendor 2 and 3 both provide a quote and meet all of your specifications. Who gets the award? The award will go either to vendor 2 or 3, whichever is the lower of the 2. What if you've been doing business with vendor 2 for 10 years, but vendor 3 is the lowest? You still need to go with vendor 3. Now you need to purchase paper products. Paper is not a perishable item. You anticipate the aggregate cost will be $17,500. Therefore, you can still use informal procurement. You write the specifications that indicate the type of product you are looking for, total quantity, etc. You call 3 vendors and all provide quotes that meet your specification. Which vendor is awarded? In this scenario, all the vendors meet the specifications and are responsible. Therefore, the lowest of the 3 vendors will be awarded the paper purchase. Moving on to formal procurement. You can see on the chart where the dollar thresholds establish this method. There are 2 methods for conducting formal procurement: invitation for bid, or an IFB, or a request for proposal, an RFP. If procuring a food service management company for full service, you must use the RFP. That will make more sense as I explain the difference between the 2. An invitation for bid is typically used for a product or good, not a service. The specifications must be specific enough to obtain the quality of product desired, but not overly restricted to limit full and open competition. A product brand cannot be specified unless it is written that an equal product is also permitted. The award is made to the lowest responsive bidder, so it is based on cost. It is also known as a sealed bid because it is sealed, open publicly, and the price determines the vendor who is awarded. This method results in a fixed price contract. That means for every unit, I'll pay X amount. Invitation for bid is used for something where there is very little subjectivity to it. An IFB would be used for perishable items where the aggregate purchase would be $150,000 and above. A request for proposal is usually used to purchase something qualitative, such as a service. Again, the statement of work contains sufficient detail. Cost is a primary factor, but it is not the sole factor, and that is what sets an RFP apart from an IFB. The RFP must include an evaluation method that notifies potential vendors of the point scale or the scoring matrix. Qualitative factors such as experience, past performance, approach, financial and technical resources can and should be included in the evaluation method. This procurement method will result in either a fixed price contract, which, as we discussed, is generally a fixed amount for a specific unit, or a cost reimbursable contract, where the vendor is reimbursed for actual costs plus allowable fees. So, an RFP is used when there is subjectivity to what is being procured. There may be different approaches to get the service you are desiring. Let's look at some common scenarios where the formal procurement method is used. I'm a school district and I decide to contract out the food service employees. I keep the food service director and the food service secretary because they will perform the duties that cannot be contracted out. This is for a very specific service, so an IFB should suffice. I write specifications indicating the number of employees I am seeking, the number of hours to work, duties to be performed, training needed, etc. The IFB is publicly advertised in 2 newspapers for 3 weeks. 3 vendors submit sealed bids by the due date. All 3 vendors provide quotes and meet the specifications. However, the school district worked with vendor number 2 in the past for other services and experienced poor service. Which vendor wins this contract? In this scenario, vendor 2 would not be considered a responsible vendor because of the prior experience the school district had with them. Therefore, vendor 1 or 3 would be awarded the contract depending on which one is the lowest bidder. As a side note, it is important to keep documentation about contractors so that if an event does come up like this, you can document the past history and that makes them not responsible. Otherwise, you could be setting yourself up for a challenge to the award or bid protest. Not liking someone is different than true performance issues, and you want to make sure you can document it in case you are questioned. In this scenario, the food service director had to go on emergency extended medical leave. You need a consultant to help out your school district until the food service director returns. You talk to your colleagues and determine it will probably cost more than $19,400 for 10 months of consulting work. This is obviously non-perishable, so formal procurement is needed. But since the duties to be performed are very specific, the IFD will suffice. You write the specifications indicating the number of hours per week, experience necessary, etc. The IFD is publicly advertised. 3 vendors submit quotes. Vendor 1 cannot provide the number of hours requested. Vendor 3 does not have the required experience or qualifications required per the specification. Who is awarded the contract? In this scenario, vendor 2 is the only responsible bidder. In very limited situations, there may be an appropriate use for non-competitive procurement. Non-competitive procurement is just that. There is not a competitive procurement process used. Sole source contracts are usually only allowable when the product or service is only available from a single vendor and/or after an attempt to competitively procure, it is determined there is inadequate competition. There are occasions when the Division of Food and Nutrition will allow for emergency waivers. For example, we frequently get a request that a food service director has suddenly resigned, and the school is at a loss as to what to do without a director if there's no one in place in the ranks that can fill in. In order for a quick turnaround and prevent disruption of food service to students, we will provide schools approval to select a consultant or vendor to use to fill in the gap for a very short time period. This allows time for a long-term solution to be put into place. Even when using a sole source or an emergency waiver, you must still do your due diligence to make sure the cost is reasonable. Once again, document thoroughly why this method was used. Another type of non-competitive procurement that is encouraged in appropriate situations is intergovernmental agreements. Schools are considered local governments, so an LEA may purchase from another LEA with the understanding that the originating LEA competitively procured the product. LEAs must still do due diligence to ensure cost is reasonable, and they should check with the selling LEA to make sure they conducted proper procurement. Examples of intergovernmental agreements are the 3086 agreement that is used between LEA to LEA to purchase meals. And that's what it's only for. 3086 is only for the purchase of meals. Or for one county agency to have an agreement to purchase meals from another county agency, insomuch that the proper procurement procedures were utilized by the originating or selling LEA. Or in this case, it was the county government. Piggybacking is another method of non-competitive procurement. So that is when one LEA has a contract with a vendor and you enter into that same contract under the same terms and conditions. The original solicitation must have allowed for piggybacking. So in this case, if one school goes out and they do the bidding and for their perishable items, and another school wants to piggyback onto that contract, that original solicitation, when the originating school went out to bid, that contract would have had to indicate that piggybacking was allowed. Once you identify the type of procurement method you will use, you will write the solicitation. This is where everything we just reviewed comes together. But it takes a lot of work. This is often known as a statement of work. So as you've heard me say before, there is a balance of providing enough information, but not so much that it limits free and open competition. But you must keep in mind that what you ask for is what you are stuck with, because the contract cannot deviate from the solicitation. Here is a list of items that you may want to include in your solicitation. Scope of work, product specification, bid and performance bond, record-keeping requirements, and the list goes on. Regardless of the procurement method, formal or informal, the Buy American provision must be included when procuring food purchased for the school nutrition programs. The product must be produced and processed in the United States. There are two exceptions: product not available domestically, such as bananas, or competitive bids reveal the cost of the domestic product is significantly higher. Keep in mind, the original intent of the program was to support agriculture at the same time as providing children in need with access to meals. When Buy American is not followed, domestic agriculture and the jobs that support agriculture are at risk. Also, whether using formal or informal procurement, you may implement a geographic preference. Note, this is not and cannot be a geographic requirement. It is only a preference. All procurement processes described in this webinar must be followed properly. Federal regulations do not prescribe a precise way the geographic preference could be applied or how much preference can be given to local products. The key is that geographic preference does not interfere with free and open competition. Please note, when applying geographic preference, origin is tied to the agricultural product, not the location of the responding vendor. Now that we know about the regulations and common players in procurement procedures, let us look at some common terms and definitions. We already talked about cost reimbursable and fixed price contracts. A cost reimbursable with a fixed fee is where the vendor is reimbursed for actual cost of services, but there is a fixed fee on each invoice, such as an administrative or management fee. Be certain items covered through an administrative or management fee are not also billed in the cost reimbursable component. Sometimes contracts that anticipate renewals will build in escalation clauses into the original contract. For example, hourly wages for contractor staff will increase by no more than 3%, or a lot of times cannot exceed a standard inflation index. Cost reimbursable with a fixed fee component means that the contract, as above, includes a fee that is an agreed upon amount of money. Fixed, as in the exception of a cost reimbursable contract, and includes all contractor direct and indirect administrative costs and profits allocable to the contract. Escalation is a clause in the contract that guarantees a change in the agreement price based on a factor beyond the control of either party that have been determined. An important example of this is a contract that adjusts for inflation. Escalator clauses are common in contracts to cover unexpected costs due to fluctuations in the prices for raw materials, fuel, and labor during the course of the contract duration. De-escalation is the provision in a contract that calls for a decrease in price in the event of a decrease in certain costs. Overly responsive, including goods and services offered in response to a solicitation, that were not requested in the original solicitation. The offered product or service must not be considered when evaluating or scoring responses for this contract award. Value added. Unlike overly responsive, value added means that the response to the solicitation include products or services that were included in the original solicitation. However, the response includes items and services that are higher in quality than requested. Likely, overly responsive, the higher quality product or service must not be considered when evaluating or scoring responses for the contract award. The next is to advertise solicitation. With informal procurement, you don't need to advertise. However, you do need to advertise with formal procurement. This must occur once a week for 3 weeks in 2 major newspapers of broad circulation. If this is not available, then the ad must be posted in at least 5 public places. For FSMC contracts, we require that both occur. And instead of posting in 5 public places, we require it be emailed or mailed to 5 potential vendors. The RFP or the IFP is not placed in the ad, but the ad must tell them how to obtain the RFP or the IFB, and it must contain a due date for the proposals. Adequate time should be allowed for presentations, demos, walkthroughs, etc., depending on what was required in the solicitation. The length of time the bid is on the street often depends on the complexity. Once the proposals come in, they are evaluated. The first step in evaluating the proposal is to determine the proposal's responsiveness or over-responsiveness. Remember that over-responsiveness or value-added proposals can be totally disregarded, but at a minimum, the overly responsive or value-added component must not be taken into consideration during the evaluation. Evaluate the proposal based on the published criteria. More than one person should evaluate the proposals, but odd numbers often work best. Each member should thoroughly document the rationale for scoring. Through the evaluation and then potential negotiations, depending on language in the solicitation, the vendor is then selected. Remember, during the solicitation, there cannot be a deviation from the scope of what the original solicitation stated. Since the contract is essentially a combination of the solicitation and the selected proposal, the actual contract doesn't really contain any new information. There should be no surprises, additions, etc. You will see that many of the contract elements are similar to the solicitation elements. Again, you have the scope of work, the type of contract, bid and performance bonds, record-keeping requirements, etc. As mentioned previously, the contract cannot deviate from the original solicitation. This includes renewals. Material changes, which are very subjective, require the initiation of a new procurement. Finally, we get to one of the most important aspects of the process, which is managing the contract. It is absolutely essential and required that the LEA maintain oversight over all contracts and to monitor their performance to ensure the quantity, quality, and timeliness of goods is according to the solicitation. All costs should be reviewed and every invoice to ensure all costs are allowable and they are net of rebates, discounts, and credits. In other words, contractors should provide adequate documentation to support all line items on the invoice, and those items should be reviewed to ensure costs are allowable before the LEA pays them. Oftentimes, we see that once the contract is awarded, the contractor is given somewhat free rein and the contract is provided with little oversight. As indicated in the beginning of the presentation, Division of Food and Nutrition is required to have greater oversight of the procurement process. And as part of that oversight, we will be required to look at all aspects of the procurement process described today. We are quickly trying to become experts on procurement and provide the necessary training before we begin to review this process at the LEAs. So please communicate out to your colleagues the importance of understanding the procurement regulations and procurement process. As we learn more about the expectations of procurement and the procurement process, we will communicate that out to you. Here's my contact information if you have any questions regarding procurement.